Just the other day, I was asked an extremely intriguing question. Basically, Jim, if your transplant story, your situation, the scenario that you went through during the transplant process leading up to it, if everything were perfect, how would that look? Let's talk about that.
Hit the subscribe button and the bell notification to become part of the Transplant Helper community.
Hey folks, welcome back to Transplant Helper again today. My name is Jim Merle, and in considering the perfect transplant situation, if my journey, my story were absolutely all I ever wanted to be, or maybe yours, how would that really look? For me, basically, it would look like me going into the heart transplant unit on one day after being treated for a number of years and finally being told I needed a heart transplant. Now, even though that would be scary and I wouldn't know what to do and I would be overwhelmed by such news, the doctor would straightly tell me, Jim, I tell you what you need to do. You need to go home and over the course of the next few weeks or maybe months, enjoy your family and friends, gather your loved ones around, and just prepare for that day that we're absolutely sure is going to come. I would do exactly as he asked, and I would come home and spend time with my family and all my friends, and they would gather around, and we would have cookouts and do all the fun things that I would expect I would love to do. And then during that period, at one point, the phone would ring. I'd grab the phone, pick it up, knowing it was UAB Hospital on the other end, and they would simply say, Jim, we have the perfect match. Just make your way, take your time, but make your way over here to UAB and we'll be ready for transplant. It's an absolutely perfect match. There should be no problems. And I would drive that hour and 15 minutes, arrive over there at UAB Hospital, walk myself into the 5th floor, the heart transplant unit, sit down on the side of the bed. They would place a couple of IV lines. And again, my friends and family would have all been gathered around and they would give me a hug and they would have scurried me away to surgery with all the confidence in the world that everything would be fine. I would come out of surgery at some point, and immediately after coming out of surgery, I would realize I had no breathing tubes, no IVs, no monitors on, and they would quickly ask me if I'd like to sit up on the side of the bed or maybe in a chair or even take a walk. I would jump up and do that, and I would feel absolutely amazing. There would be no issues there. Everything would be perfect. The doctors would tell me again what a wonderful match it was, and after about maybe 24 to 48 hours, I would be able to go home, and I would come home, and there would be no medications to take, no biopsies to endure, no difficulties, and I would be going on for decades, maybe multiple decades, enjoying my time with my family and friends, and everything would be, as you would say, perfect. But friends, let me tell you something. Most of you already realize this, but there is no such thing as a perfect transplant. You see, as opposed to that perfect situation, my story was quite a bit different. As a matter of fact, my story kind of starts where I started with that one, and that is, yes, I had been treated by a heart failure / transplant team for a number of years. But you see, during that number of years that I'm referring to, which amounted itself to about 6, I was actually evaluated for transplant 4 times. And out of 3 of those 4 times, those times at least, those first 3, I was basically denied transplant because I was too healthy. Now, I took that as good news, obviously. I knew that if I was too healthy for transplant, obviously that was a good sign, and the expectation of my life continuing on was going to be pretty good. But that wouldn't always be the case. You see, it was during the end of that, I should say, that 4th transplant evaluation, many discoveries were made concerning my whole situation, my overall health, and it was determined then that transplant was absolutely inevitable. I was listed for transplant after that process, and I'll tell you, for my purposes, it only took a few days, and I was happy to do that. But I was sent home to wait. Not wait for a week or so with family and friends surrounding me, but yet to wait for what amounted to, in total, about a 10-month period. 265 days to be exact. And it was during those 265 days that I endured some of the most difficult, trying, anxious times of my entire life. Being on an IV medication, such as many of you were as well, if you're a heart patient, being on an IV medication known as milrinone was no easy task. The medication itself, albeit gave me quite a bit of energy on some standards, on another, just having the medication wore me out. Walking around 24/7, tied to an IV pole, or in my case, many times an IV packet, a bag, in a fanny pack was pretty difficult. Continue to monitor that, having home health coming in 2 to 3 days a week, spending time changing the bandages, instructing me on what to do, checking my vital signs, sleeping for what amounted to between 16, 18 hours per day, unable to eat a meal or do any type of physical activity, and even something as simple as brushing my teeth or, taking a shower could be something that could wipe me out for the entire day. Things were difficult. Watching my family and friends that, albeit I expected and hoped they might gather around and rally around and we would have all those great days, that didn't really exist. They supported me, but in some of those cases, at least, they didn't know what to do or say. So many of them, rather than spend that quality time that I would have hoped they could have done, actually separated themselves far from me and just kind of stood in the background and waited for that moment when they thought either I would receive transplant or possibly die. The separation anxiety that existed between me and my wife and my children, perhaps my parents and other of those closer relationships, became great, and the stress was enormous. My wife, ultimately my daughter, had to seek counseling and medications to deal with some of the anxieties and the stress, and in many cases, even the depression that came from watching a loved one assumingly die. The struggles were real. Dealing with all the doctor's appointments and follow-ups and the never knowing, and things such as sitting around the house and maybe even spending a little time in the yard, which I like to do, albeit it was sitting in a chair, just watching my children in a distance play. But I would hear an ambulance go by, or in our case, the life flight helicopters fly over, and it would cause a huge level of anxiety, one of which was so divided. On the one hand, I hope that life flight, that helicopter going over, was the one that was containing what ultimately would become my new heart transplant. On another hand, there was a period of mourning in each of those flights and each of those sounds, because I knew that meant that even though I might receive life, someone was obviously going to have to die. And I could feel every day, even though my call wasn't coming in, I could feel the pain. I could feel the anxiety of the loss that they would have. And ultimately, I was feeling the loss that I would have. And again, as I referred to it a moment ago, that separation anxiety became real. And to an extent, I started, without even realizing what I was doing, to push some of those family members away and to make distance between us and try to build those walls of separation. So maybe if I didn't make it, the pain wouldn't be so bad. Ultimately, though, after about 10 months, again on that IV medication and multiple doctor's appointments and many, many days where I could hardly get out of bed or do anything physical whatsoever, ultimately, I went to the doctor one day, not exactly like the scenario pictured, but I went in the doctor one day assuming that I was going to be back home when I was told, Jim, you're going to be placed in the hospital. As I refer to it now, I was condemned to the hospital, left in the hospital to either receive transplant or, honestly, to die. That hospital stay, which for me consisted of basically about a month, a little less than that, was a very, very trying time. A time of loneliness, a time of worry, a time of sadness, a time of mourning, a time of not knowing what was next was extremely difficult. The days when, even though my family, including my wife, my children, my parents, they wanted to be there every day, every moment, it just wasn't possible. So there were many lonely days and nights that I spent there in the hospital. If it hadn't been for my family, my transplant family, that is the staff, I would have had no one. But even at times, it was just that situation where you didn't want anyone around. Those days were tough. The day I received the call, May the 15th of 2013, was a day I'll never forget. It didn't turn out to be the day I wanted. Didn't turn out to be the victory I was planning to receive, but nonetheless, it was a huge disappointment. You see, that day was a day that I was deathly ill. struggling and grasping at life, but yet that call that came in did not turn out to be a match. It didn't turn out to be what I wanted it to be. So that perfect transplant scenario, already being broken in so many areas, now was basically shattered in this one because my gift wasn't coming, so I might assume. I could remember that all my family and friends had come that day. There were probably 20 or 25 gathered in around, coming in and out of the room, every one of them cheering and, praying along and celebrating. But again, the news was not that good. Thankfully, the window of hope that I did receive, even though I didn't receive that transplant, that organ, was that I got to step out in the hallway and shake the man's hand who did. But again, I faded in that room all alone, struggling and worried, concerned, not knowing if time would ever come. Not exactly your perfect transplant story. Ultimately, though, 7 days later, May the 22nd, actually, the call came in for me, but it was May the 23rd. I did receive the gift of life. And unlike that perfect scenario, even though my surgery went smoothly, and even though, yes, I woke up from surgery quickly, and even though, yes, I didn't exactly get my breathing tube out immediately, but it was within the first 45 minutes to an hour, all that seemed great. But getting out of bed and walking down the halls and all the things that I ultimately would find victory in doing and be able to do were not as smooth as I expected. Matter of fact, that was extremely painful. That was extremely trying. It tested my faith. It tested everything in me. There were many days that I laid in that bed, after transplant, even knowing I'd received the wonderful gift of life, and I questioned my decision as to whether or not I'd made the right choice. Ultimately, I was released from the hospital fairly quickly, about a week or so later, and ultimately, yes, I was able to come home, and ultimately, yes, the gift of life, here it is, 8 years past transplant, and I've continued to do relatively well with the exception of a few bumps in the road. But again, the struggle was always there. The times that I endured, the situations that I experienced were not always perfect. And I told you all that to do two things. One, to give you a picture of what that perfect story would be like, but to tell you and remind you that is only in fairy tale. Oh, I've seen people be transplanted quickly, get a transplant within a few hours of originally being listed. But I promise you, the rest of that would have all been fictitious. It's just not happening. But I'll tell you this too. No matter how your journey has gone or will go, it's all worth it. The pain, the struggles, the trials, the crying in waking hours, the anxiety and depression and everything that you have to fight for, I promise you, is worth it. Will our journeys look similar? Yes, if you say in the fact that I may recover from heart transplant and you may recover from heart transplant, yes. They're similar in that way, but only in that way. So let me tell you something else. If you're facing transplant, or maybe you're one of those people like I know who are just fresh out of transplant, if you will, within a few days or a few months, or maybe inside of that first year, just be aware. Just be completely honest with open eyes and say it will be a fight. You will have to go to war. You will have to struggle. You will have to endure pain. You will have to endure things and fight for the little things in life to ultimately receive the wonderful gift of life. And there will be bumps in the road. There'll be hard times. There'll be difficult days. There'll be struggles that come on every facet of life. Obviously the physical, obviously the emotional, obviously even sometimes the spiritual, mentally, in every way you will be tested. But it is a test worth enduring. So yes, there's no perfect situation. I have a dream of what it would look like if anyone were ever to receive it, but I know that's not going to happen. My story is not the most difficult I've ever heard. It's not the most traumatic or dramatic I've ever heard, but it's certainly for me, it was mine. And it continues to be so. So when you hear me saying things on the end of the tail end of this program or any other, like stay stronger, friends, I mean that. Stay stronger, be stronger emotionally, mentally, physically, and spiritually. When you hear me say things like KOKO, which means keep on keeping on, that's exactly what you have to do. As a matter of fact, if I were to summarize what transplant life is like, I would summarize it with those 4 letters representing those 4 words. Keep on keeping on. Never give up. Never stop the fight. Take a stand for your health and take a stand for your life. I appreciate all of you who have joined me today. I appreciate every one of you who have supported me and encouraged me and given me the best life I've ever had. Stay stronger, friends.